What is up, Brad fans? How you doing? How you living? Here's a question for you. Have you ever thought about how science information gets turned into science news that ends up on your device? If you look at a article on a news website that happens to be about science, how accurate is it? How much do you trust it? My guess is you probably somebody's checked it. But there's a long pipeline that brings scientific knowledge created in the lab to the scientific community via academic publishing, then to press releases that universities or academic journals might put out, which are then picked up by mainstream journalists and then brought to websites, TikTok, social media, all the places for you. And along that pathway, there's a lot of influences that could distort the message or change the quality or change the interpretation of that original tidbit of knowledge. It can also be presented as more sensational or more set in stone, let's say, more like an endpoint, a fact, rather than just one step in the never-ending journey that is scientific discovery. And this is the topic of conversation of this episode with my guest, Elisa Nelissen. Elisa is a Ph.D. researcher in translational studies at the KU Leuven University here in Belgium, and her work focuses on this pipeline. Elisa also worked as a press officer for an academic journal and the KU Leuven University, so she's seen many sides of this process. And our conversation went a lot of different places. We talked about the pipeline itself, how it works, and where some of the pinch points, let's say, or problem areas might arise that could lead to a distortion of the message. We talked about the motivations of the different people in this pipeline, the different institutions in this pipeline, and how that will affect how they present the work, the science at different stages. We just talked about differences in how academics or scientists will write about and think about the knowledge that they're creating from the way that it is presented in news media. What are some of the tensions there? And we discussed how people should think about fact-checking their science news. We talked about the so-called issue of trust in science. Is it really a problem? Do most people trust science? Should people be trustful of science? Do most people even really care or need to understand what's going on in science? Perhaps traditional news media and the news article, the breaking news style article, is not the best way to communicate science. And many other topics. You can see just by this intro that this conversation went a lot of different places. And I was really, really excited by it because obviously this is what I do for a living, and I'm also very passionate about it. And this conversation got me to challenge some of my assumptions, like, is there a crisis of trust in science? How much should each person know about science? Got me thinking more about the motivations of people for engaging with science. What has it done for me? If they don't see a value in it, personally, maybe they're just not going to care why we're going to the moon, for example. So always good to take a look in your own house and try and clean up your thinking about your own profession and what you do. But I also think it's broadly interesting to an audience that's listening to this podcast, knowing that they come here for science information and discussions like this about how science is created and then communicated. I think this is a really, really fascinating thing that not a lot of people think about. How do we create knowledge and then play that game of telephone, of bringing that knowledge to people, and that's us, but then also the people that make policy, that make decisions based on this information that could have consequences for all of us. So how are we all receiving this message? And are there ways that we can improve that pipeline of information? So many thanks to Elisa again for joining me. I really, really loved the conversation. before we get to that, as always, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Rate, review, leave a comment. That helps us out a lot. You can also follow us on social media. Too Bad For You at Instagram is the best way to get in touch with us and to follow along with the show. You can also check the show notes of every episode for links to our website, our social media, and ways in which you can help support the show. But really, all I ask, tell a friend, subscribe, rate, comment. That would be amazing. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. Here is my conversation with Elisa Nelissen. All right. Well, this is kind of fitting that we're going to be talking about media, science news, and we're here at the University Media Center in their fancy podcast studio, checking it out. Thank you so much for being here, Elisa. For clarity, we are working on a science communication project together. Yeah, so we've known each other a little bit. I got to see a peek at some of your work, your PhD work. Why don't we start with an introduction for you? And I noticed in going through your CV, what's online, that you started as a press officer at the university, KU Leuven, where we are now, and then moved to doing a PhD. So why don't you give us something that I don't know if it gets asked a lot, but what is your motivation for doing science communication? Because you started in a press office and now are researching sort of science communication. And then tell us about your journey from press office to what you're doing now, and then we'll get into the research.
All right. Okay, great. And thank you for having me, by the way. I'm very excited. That's quite a long story, but I'll keep it short. I studied a degree which focused on publishing because I really wanted to get into the literary publishing world. So I wasn't necessarily interested in science when I was a student in that sense. I was interested in new media and in books, and I loved knowledge in that sense. But I also just loved the tangibility of books. So also was into old media. And I studied a degree that combined all of that and focused on publishing. But they were very pragmatic, and they said, well, we already know there's not too much future in literary publishing, especially if you speak Dutch, unfortunately.
An even smaller audience, yeah.
Yes. And so they focused heavily on academic publishing, and that was kind of my introduction into that world. So I stepped into the world of science via the world of publishing. And then I got an internship at Elsevier, which is the world's largest academic publisher. And that turned into a job, and eventually I moved into a press officer role there. So that is how I got into the world of science news and science journalism. And then it just also the academic publishing world became really fascinating to me because it's quite an odd business model. And I am happy to talk about that later. This a connection between academia and then the commercial setting with lots of nonprofit initiatives also now, which are putting a lot of pressure on big commercial companies like Elsevier. And in science journalism, I also noticed some interesting things that were happening. I was in charge of finalizing press releases and sending them out to the world for a really large number of journals. So that was quite overwhelming sometimes. And then I also was sort of following how that news then eventually got covered in the press. And then you get to see interesting things that happen to it sometimes. And so I got really interested in all of that. And I was able to continue that in my job again as a press officer here in Leuven when I moved back to Belgium. And a position at some point opened up for a project, to work on a project that I'm now working on about the circulation of science news in and to Flanders, and sometimes also from Flanders to other parts of the world. And so the project really fit everything that that I had been doing so far. I have a background in linguistics and languages and then media, an interest in journalism. I also studied a bit of journalism. And so it combined all of these things. So it was just perfect for me. I couldn't have written a better proposal myself. So I was lucky enough that someone else did it, my supervisor, Jack McMartin. And I got the job. And here I am 3 years later.
Interesting. I mean, it's cool to me because, and we can get into this because I think it's kind of the theme of your work, from what I understand of it, is this journey of knowledge, that's created in labs by scientists, and then they need to publish it somewhere. So they publish it in the academic journals. You mentioned, there's some conflicts that happen there with the commercialization of that. But then it's got to go from there to the public, let's say. And I feel like in science communication, science journalism, all this stuff, we talk about the public. We just kind of, in air quotes, whatever, like that just encapsulates everybody. There's obviously a lot of different audiences, and I'd say most audiences aren't tuned into science. But there's this idea of, we got to get this knowledge out. We got to get this knowledge out. And I'm juggling with a bunch of different ideas in my head right now. But let's maybe start with just, again, because when I talk to people that do science communication, science journalism, everybody seems to say that there's this motivation of like, well, science is, we have to get it out there. A lot of academics will say this too. When I talk to like researchers that are doing like genetics or chemistry or whatever, they're like, well, we have to get it out there. We have to get it out there. But what do you think, like, just personally, why is SciComm important to you? Because I get the whole noble idea that, people are paying for this with public money, so we got to tell them what we're doing. And that's the standard things that we always hear. But I mean, for me, who does it as a job, I couldn't see myself doing anything else. Like, it's also just like, it's just a fun job. Mm-hmm. So it's like, it doesn't have to be high-minded all the time. What do you think? What's your sort of take on this? Why should we get science out there? Do you have a personal take or maybe a different angle on the professional take of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question and a difficult one for me also. And I have to say, I don't do that much science communication myself anymore these days, which is quite strange. And it often gets very meta in these types of discussions. But I do believe in that argument that since science is conducted with lots of public money, that there is a responsibility to also get it out there in a way that is accessible to people, and that means much more than freely available, for example, in a way that's understandable and interesting and relevant. It doesn't really matter if the research or the way that you bring the research isn't packaged well, or isn't just simply relevant for people, which can be true. And not all research has to be communicated to everyone. Because indeed, there is that sense of getting it out there, which I also got frequently when I was working as a press officer, that people didn't seem to have a detailed idea of what that really entailed. For me, it's about, if I personally would do science communication, it's about connecting with people who are interested in this kind of thing. So again, they would also be interested in science communication. So we're getting meta again. And that would be my personal motivation. So I, of course, I'm not a health researcher, so there's different things at stake there. And if you're talking about public health, which is relevant to everyone, you could argue. But for me, it would be about that connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I think it's like, then you get into, you mentioned something there that stuck with me. Is not every bit of research needs to be communicated to everyone, and that's one of the faults, I think. And we did say before we turned record on that we don't want to be too negative, but here I go. One of the faults, I think, of, let's say academics like chemists or, people that are doing sort of the STEM stuff, and then they're like, well, we got to get our research out there to the public. They don't understand that, well, most people aren't going to be interested, so like, think about who's going to be interested and why they might be interested. Or if you really truly believe that, like, this people need to hear this, then why? And you got to explain that, and you got to make that clear. Otherwise, people are going to tune out. And so I guess this is all kind of pushing towards, again, this idea that there's a disconnect I think, already between academics and science media. Some people in science media don't understand how academia works and vice versa. So this trail of knowledge starting in a lab, being created in a lab, and then making its way out, it's a pretty interesting process. And a lot of places where we could say, I don't want to say that it could go wrong, but it could get distorted or the message could get lost, that kind of thing. And the fact that the people doing this stuff don't know a lot about this, well, what do we expect? Again, this public, as I do air quotes, well, what are they supposed to think about it? And I think that most people don't think about it. They just sort of see headlines and they either, I guess these days, trust it or don't trust it. All of that long-windedness, just to kind of put you, can you begin to describe to us this journey of information? Because again, I don't know that people understand academic publishing, the costs that go into that. So there's that financial thing. And then a press officer. What is a press officer trying to do? Finally, and then maybe I could jump in and talk about, as a journalist, what we do with the press releases. But
I can try to venture an answer about the process, mostly based on my experience working as a press officer and a bit of my experience of doing this research on this project. For the project, we have been looking mostly at what happens in newsrooms in Flanders, as well as news agencies. And we're now sort of at that press release stage. So we're kind of going back in the chain of events between the researchers and the audience of news. But if you start from the other side, which we haven't done, but which is, of course, the natural way, there's so many things involved in publishing, and maybe we shouldn't go into too much detail, but indeed, most science journalism is kind of based on publications that have appeared somewhere, especially when you talk about hard news. Then that fact that something has just been published is a really important news angle, I think, even though that usually discusses research that is months and months or even years old, and maybe has been even lying around at the editor's office of that journal for that much time, because the peer review process also takes very long. So the concept of new is sometimes a bit.
I would say too that data can sit in the professor's computer for years, like they've run these experiments and they just don't have time to go through, or they don't have the students or whatever, things happen. So then this benchmark of science journalism being like, it's now been published in the journals, the academic journals, now it's new, now it's news. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily true.
And I mean, there are good reasons for that. Of course, it is to some extent available, depending on the access that you get to the specific journal that it is published in. But technically, you would be able to read a report. It has been peer reviewed, and that's considered very important quality label, although again that is also debatable. There are often reports in the media about when things go wrong. I think there was an article or a study that was published recently that was retracted, where the researchers used AI-generated imagery. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I did see that. Yeah.
And then some reporting on that.
You tend to get a lot of reporting when they get caught. When somebody gets caught doing something.
Yes, of course. There's no end to the reporting of when it goes right. So so indeed, the media likes to focus on that. But so, that seems to work very well with journalism, the fact that a paper is published and then it can be written about or covered in another way. But then still, there are so many new papers being published each day that it is almost impossible. I mean, you can comment on this, but impossible to keep up as a journalist with what is new. And I want to add to that also, there are some disciplines in academia that don't really work with this tradition, with this model of publishing papers in peer-reviewed journals. Computer science, they publish papers, but not necessarily peer-reviewed because they work a lot with preprints. But also in my own discipline, humanities research in general, there's still a lot of books, and new research isn't as digestible necessarily, that it fits into a paper. So that also is a bit lost in that system. And I think that does translate to maybe different or less coverage for some disciplines that don't work like that. But then,
or a skewed coverage of it. Yeah.
yeah.
I see what you're saying. Yeah.
But so to sort of filter those vast amounts of new research that are published, you can do different things. Of course, you can follow the top journals, which a lot of journalists do. And so the top ranked journals also get significantly more coverage. So I'm talking like Nature and Science, those kinds of journals, the Lancet for Health. But also press releases play a crucial role because they provide a really important filter, kind of put on the agenda what is potentially newsworthy. And they also make that first translation of a technical study into layman's terms. So it is also very convenient for a reporter to quickly skim a press release and scan whether the actual research that it refers to is interesting or worth covering. The problem with that is that in this day and age with lots of online news that is sort of constantly has to be updated, and news media that are writing 60, 70, 80 articles each day, that a lot of those press releases and find their way into the media more or less unchanged. And then I'm mostly talking about media or work by journalists who aren't science journalists. And a lot of science journalism is performed by journalists who aren't science journalists. And I think that's a very important distinction. And so there, especially, you see a lot of copy pasting and that kind of stuff. And so those press releases actually play a very important role, I would argue.
Yeah. Actually, that's kind of an interest. Maybe that's a good point to sort of sit on here for a second, is that, we're talking about, what I do. Like, I consider myself a science journalist. I wouldn't really say, I didn't have journalism training. I didn't go to journalism school. It's really heavily focused. It's niche, really. So the publications that I'm writing for are, yes, they're like titles like Chemistry World, so it's not like again, like a broad, super broad audience, right? So when we're talking about science journalism not being performed by science journalists, we're talking about sort of, what we would consider like newspapers. I mean,
Yes.
I know newspapers physically don't exist anymore, but we're talking about these.
Still.
But these kind of news organizations, in Canada, we have the CBC, UK has BBC, and then there's private ones, all that. So these are newsrooms, very traditional, what you think of when you think of journalists and news. And surprisingly, maybe to some people, is the people that cover science there are journalists, but they don't have that scientific background. So asking them to cover gravity changing, theoretical physics stuff is really difficult. So this is where these press releases come in. And so press releases, they're put out by the journals or the universities and stuff. And they're, like you said, first attempt at sort of putting it into a story, layman's terms. But what do you think then about, this is something that I always hear from people that work in those sort of, again, more traditional newsrooms, is that science isn't really that popular for them. That's not what people go there for, right? So their budget for science journalism, for covering these stories, gets smaller and smaller and smaller every year. So it feels then that it's like, to me, it feels like it's a neglected beat, we'll say, topic area. So then you see the copy and pasting of press releases and stuff. Is that necessarily a bad thing if the press releases are done right, but the journalist doesn't know if it's done right? So I don't know. I guess I'm just, where do we go with this? Like, we've identified this link in the chain then. What do we say about it? What's the action, I guess?
Whew.
Again, I told you, I throw stuff out there and then just, hey, react to that.
That is a very important question for sure. But I also don't really know the answer. The system has been working like this for maybe 20, 30 years. And for example, I'm now doing a study into Eureka Alert, which is a platform that these press offices use to publish their press releases on. And so a lot of journalists also go there, science journalists again,
Yeah,
to get their
I'm a
news.
user of Eureka.
Yeah.
Every day I check it up
Every
there.
year still they get more and more submissions. Apart from last year, they had a dip, but I think that was mostly because they changed some things to their platform. So that system is still sort of in full bloom, it seems. I don't know where it's going to end. Occasionally things go wrong in terms of big stories, but I think the biggest that we have were in the pandemic, where there was some reports about this concept of doing science by press release when there was actually not really a peer-reviewed study available. And so even in Flanders, which also doesn't have a lot of science journalism, the media did focus a bit on that whole system behind the news that was in the papers about science and then specifically the virus. But now we're maybe more or less past the pandemic, and it seems that everything has kind of just gone back to the way things were. In Flanders, which is where I focus my research on, I wouldn't necessarily say that science isn't a popular beat, but it really depends on the discipline. So health, especially, is really big. And so it becomes difficult to define what is science journalism and what isn't, but there is a lot of news about health and the environment, climate.
Yeah, climate,
that touches upon or doesn't scientific research. So I struggle with that in my research, is just simply defining what I count as science journalism and what I don't. So those topics are big, but we here also don't have that many science journalists, really only a handful. Of course, it's a small region. And you do see a lot of that press releases that are covered, and no one seems to be too troubled by it. So I'm not sure if there is really a problem with it. It doesn't always feel right to me, because I've been on the other side, or in the middle kind of it, and I've seen research that was definitely misrepresented. These stories, of course, I mean, the next day everyone is kind of already forgotten about them, but then there is another story that says X about a cancer treatment, and another one that says Y about healthy eating behavior. And I'm focusing on health because that, of course, has direct implications for your own behavior. And so I feel like it does contribute to a sort of a continuous confusion about what is happening in science. Why is it so contradictory? Why is it, the first one day they say this, the other they say that. But I don't know what the solution is, because I haven't spoken to many journalists who are too bothered by it, apart from science journalists.
Yeah. And I guess for me, the idea of just sort of, cutting and pasting a press release, first of all, it just kind of feels like, well, you didn't really write, like it's just kind of lazy. But I guess it makes sense if you can't be expected to go back to the primary source and understand fully that. But I mean, this is where interviews with experts and stuff, come in. But again, if you're being asked to cover something that's so far out of your, range, that it's difficult to understand and then, interpret, analyze, and present to the next audience, right? You're going to rely on that press release because it makes it understandable for you. But then it just feels like, well, who's checking the press releases, And this is what I think maybe people don't understand, or maybe the last couple episodes I've done, everything kind of comes back to the pandemic experience, which I'm trying to avoid doing, but it's such a stark example that maybe this is the only time people thought about, and kind of like you said, well, what is the data behind the headline? Where did they get that information? And so maybe now some people think about that kind of stuff a bit more. But so for an audience that's hearing this, that's, read science news or something in their local paper or in their national paper, maybe there's less trust. Or again, like you said, it's just, you forget about it the next day. I don't know. This is what I always struggle with too, is that I focus on these things, you focus on these things, but we're a small group of people. Like, I don't know how much people really care about this.
No, but then I hear these kinds of hallway conversations, even among colleagues who are themselves academics, but then talking about, oh, have you heard X and Y about that this vitamin helps against this illness or whatever. And so even people who I would think are fairly critical, they seem to pick up information from not always as scientifically sound sources. And so there's still...
And then don't think about it critically.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, I do think it's important to at least be aware of the different dynamics that are at play in this whole ecosystem. And there are many more reasons that people want to get media attention beyond, I think it's important because this is publicly funded. There is also not so noble reasons, like it's good for my citation score, or it's good for my public image, or this will help me advance my career, or my institution will benefit from this.
Yeah. Or I got a podcast on the side. Where Okay, that's an interesting point, because that's what I say is, again, for an audience of this show that maybe doesn't know all the ins and outs. What are these dynamics? So that you've identified one there, that not all people who are putting out press releases and pushing them to pushing their research to journalists and stuff have the best intentions. Is there other dynamics at play that maybe people could think about or understand, at least when they see a science headline or something like that?
That's definitely an important one, and the publishing model as it exists today is another important one. Something to also always kind of scan for, I think, is what is this article based on? What I see often these days, especially in what we call popular newspapers or news outlets, the biggest ones in Flanders that have really large audience, is that they do interviews with experts. They have one expert and they say a bunch of things about one topic, but it goes in all directions and maybe not always very close to their own expertise. And then that is a piece of science news, or at least it looks like it. But then when you look at what they are actually mentioning and whether that's evidence-based, that sometimes also can be questioned. So look at what's behind those articles. Yeah, those motivations and intentions, I think, are very important to keep in mind. And then the fact that whether an article has been written by a science journalist or not, I think, is also a very big determinant for the quality, if I can say it like that, of a piece. And some news outlets really use science news as filler, it seems to me, also because it is so readily available, because we have all these press releases that you can copy and paste for free, and that's even their purpose. Mm-hmm. So, just be a bit wary, maybe.
Yeah. And I mean, this is always the challenge, right, for people is, and, they hear it now all the time, do your own research and check into these things and all this, all these now. So now it feels like just when you read something, you got all this other work you got to do. You're back in school, you got to check the sources and all that stuff. It happens. I get friends will send me things and be like, hey, have you seen this? What do you think of this? And it'll be some, you go, 2 clicks further in some links in the piece or whatever, and you're already at garlic is great for, killing everything. And then you click in and it's brought to you by the Garlic Institute, It's literally I saw that once and it's oh, okay. So maybe the Garlic Institute has a vested interest in this, but those kind of things. So it really actually doesn't take that long, I think, to kind of do that digging, but then you're asking people to do that. But we hear about this in the science communication world all the time. This people don't trust science anymore. People don't trust science anymore. And I wonder if there's something in this pathway to sort of, I don't know, gain that trust back. Or I don't know, maybe you disagree with even if that there is a trust issue.
I would say. Yeah. That is up for debate. Again, I mostly know data about Belgium and Flanders, but trust in science is still fairly high here. That doesn't always mean that people aren't sort of confused by what is appearing in the media about science. But if you ask, do you trust science and scientists and their institutions, then it's fairly high with some differences between them. So I'm not too sure if there is a large trust problem, especially here. But I can imagine that it is confusing to see a lot of contradictory data, because that, to me, is also an essential difference between the world of science and that of journalism, is that if you write an academic paper, then you don't pretend that that will be an end point to whatever journey of finding knowledge you have been on. You are sort of contributing a small piece, and you are kind of almost hoping that someone else might contradict you or build on your work or whatever. Whereas the way that research is then presented in the media is almost always as if it's sort of an end point, as fact. So there's a lot of tension there for me, and not one that's easy to resolve, because media relies so heavily on things that are new and easily digestible.
And a narrative with like an endpoint.
Yes, yeah, and not too complex. Whereas a literature review combines then all different studies, and so maybe your study will then end up in the literature review of another study as one of the 30, 40 papers that are mentioned, which is not necessarily how journalism works. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't, that it should, sorry. But that's definitely a big difference there.
Mm-hmm. So I think, and this is one of the conversations I've had with people, again, sort of in the field, in this area. And it's, well, maybe exactly this, like maybe newspapers, these news agencies, like our again, these sort of traditional newspapers or whatever, maybe that's not the place for this type of news, or this. And again, like you have the places that I write for, very niche sort of science magazines. And there is like popular science magazines, like in America, there's Scientific American, and in the UK, New Scientist, those exist, and they have a big readership. But again, it's like, you're already speaking to an audience who wants to know. Whereas, again, when you talk to academics or people in science communication and stuff, there's always this, but it's got to go further. We got to reach the people that aren't already interested in this. And that's why we go to the places where they go, the mass media, right? And in a sense, I kind of agree. Like some of the things I try to do with this podcast is maybe try to speak to people that aren't necessarily, already tuned in. Debatable whether it's working. I don't know. But I feel like there is some benefit to that, right? A wider understanding of science, or a deeper understanding of science, and just how it influences your life. You might not think about it, but society, we got all these technologies coming out, AI, genetics, blah, 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 all this stuff. People should probably know about this, right? So that they can make informed decisions about what you want your governments or your whatever health agencies to do, right? But on the other hand, it's like, from a business perspective, and again, just from my what I do and my motivations for doing it, I don't know that I could say it's really that high-minded. I'm like, I just like doing it, so I want to talk to other people that do it. But I guess the tension for me is maybe everyone's focused on trying to get stuff out to the mass media when there's another way. And we're just not looking for that other way because, again, this channel has been built of academic research to press release to journalism. And it's just that groove is worn in, and we're not thinking about other things that could be done. On the flip side is a kind of checks and balances there that does ensure, mistakes are made, but quality control does happen there. So maybe that's pushing us to, like, I don't know, this new media like podcasts or something, because there's a lot of science garbage out there on podcasts too. Not this one. This one's legit. But.
Solid. Yeah. That's something that we would always recommend back when I was working as a press officer, is to really think about the audience, because we also got a lot of researchers who had a very general sense that they want to get something out there. And even in a small region as Flanders, that meant like national newspapers. And that we did sometimes say, well, this might not be that relevant to this general newspaper, but have you tried this? But those alternatives often require much more work, it seems, and that whole system of press release, and it's also really ingrained in institutions, academic institutions and publishers. It works like a machine almost. It's sort of a second nature to those institutions to do it things that way. But that's not to say that we didn't do other things like very targeted pitches, for example, or recommend someone to write a blog. So there are definitely many more options than just trying to reach a mass media outlet. But I also wanted to go back to, because you mentioned earlier, what else can we do to improve the quality? Because I didn't touch too much upon that. I think you cannot really change the way that those mass media are covering science. That is very difficult. It's very difficult to get journalists to do something that you want them to do. Like they are very, they like to do things the way that they think is best. You cannot really, and that's there is a good reason for that. That's a good thing, I think. But where you can improve is, of course, or change or whatever is in the press offices, and there are definitely things you can do to have some sort of standards for quality standards. Indeed, you mentioned checks and balances, because here in Belgium there's really nothing, and so. Internationally, you have these things like Science Media Centre in the UK, organizations that have defined criteria that you should always either mention or sort of check off when you're sending out a press release, and that is all about representing the research responsibly. So, for example, don't refer to humans when you are covering research that has been done on animals is one of those main ones, or don't confuse causation with correlation. Again, one of those big errors that are often made. So I think these things need to happen at the press release stage, because research has shown that if there are that kind of errors or misrepresentations in the news, then likely they have also already been present in the press release. So there is some room there to at least improve that, and that is also to a lesser extent what we're trying to do in Belgium with our BSICOM organization, which you mentioned, where we try to bring together people that work in this field. And I'm especially interested in the people who work in journalism and from both sides, so the press officers and the journalists. And hopefully maybe at some point there will be room in Flanders or in Belgium to professionalize that a little bit. Because in terms of science journalism and embedding that into, professionalizing that field, Belgium is really behind on some of our neighboring countries, I would say.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let's maybe unpack that a little bit again for an audience that doesn't know the nuts and bolts of how all this stuff works. When a press release is made by a university, or let's say, a publisher or something like that, yeah, it's possible that they do those things that you just said that they shouldn't do.
Yeah.
And there's probably, if the incentive of the person making the press release, the organization that's doing press releases for their job, their incentive, I would imagine, is we want to see as many of these translated into news articles in a variety of different newspapers, magazines, etc. So then, yes, the motivation might be to sensationalize. And so it's kind of interesting to hear that there is no, maybe there is no standard in some places, or there is no sort of watchdog. And I think that that's maybe what people think about, audiences think about when they hear science in its end form at the journal, at the newspaper stage. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, this has been checked. Somebody's checked this.
Yes.
It's gone through something,
yeah.
Right? And other than peer review, which happens at the very first step, which is the scientists themselves deciding. And again, their criteria for what is published is very different than this idea that now it's a fact. Mm-hmm. Now it's So that's kind of interesting to hear. And a good place, I guess, that, your work and other people's work has identified that this is a place where we can really improve the quality of science journalism.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because it is also my experience that at every stage of the chain, everyone says, well, I assume that what the person who I got this from is, is trustworthy, and what they're saying is correct. I did a study, for example, in a news agency, the National News Agency of Belgium, and they would often, or even almost always mention this, like, well, it's coming from a university, so it must be good.
Yeah.
And of course, why wouldn't, I'm not saying that you have to distrust everything that universities are doing, but you should know that they have reasons for wanting to get media attention. And also, then at the press office level, often the people who are working there, sometimes they have a background in science, but often they also have a background in languages or communication, those fields. And they also have to take what researchers are telling them at face value and put them in their press release, and they can hopefully read the paper, but they won't always also have that expertise. So yeah, there is a lot of trust in the chain, and I think that is, you cannot really change that. You cannot have press officers for each discipline and have them be really experienced, and then
unless you're going to pay for all these jobs
exactly.
and people, right? And that's
and so the economic reality, let's put it like that, is not like that. And also sometimes it makes for better journalism if someone is really writing about it from a very much of an outsider perspective. But yeah, at each step, I think you have to sort of be a bit aware of the whole system around it.
Yeah, it's interesting, I think, for people to realize how much of this chain, of this sort of system is really kind of based on trust. Yeah. And again, not trying to be super negative, because I think, I don't know, I'm just throwing out a high percentage number, but like, let's say like 85% of the time, that's fine. It works, but there's always, bad actors that do bad things, right? So it's not to say that like you can't trust anything or whatever, or these people are just, passing everything along or whatever, but it's just the reality of it. And I mean, I like the point that you make that sometimes it's nice, it's beneficial to have someone who is naive on a topic report on a topic. I found that for sure. Chemistry, I mentioned that I write for Chemistry World fairly regularly. I almost failed chemistry in high school, in university. Like, it was my worst subject. But I have found, I think, that for me, that has been helpful, because you ask the questions that the obvious ones that an audience might not know, right? Or you really have to sort of break it down. But I think it's not like I'm ignorant of chemistry, right? I did pass my university chemistry courses. I did a decent job. So I understand sort of the fundamentals, the basics. And I guess that's it too, is then I don't know where to go with this idea, but it's because it's the economic reality is that we have to rely on trust in some form or another. I think most people, like you said, depending on where you are, most audiences, most countries, whatever, still have a high degree of trust. Although I saw some troubling data out of Germany. Where it was like, I can't remember what the specific question was, whether it was like biotechnology or science. It might have been specifically biotechnology or bio research or something, but people were not trusted. It was like 40% trusted it. Yeah. Which is like, and Germany's a big country, and with lots of great research institutions, they put a lot of money into research, The US, obviously, I think has a problem right now. But the UK, it's high. I think in Canada, it's still high. I don't, I'm stuck in the Western world bubble, right? But I think the things that I have seen is that countries outside of that do tend to have a high regard for science. They do. So even the audience is trusting. So I guess that's my point, is that like this whole system is based on trust, and then it gets to the end and the audience is like, well, I just got to trust it. Because again, their constraint is going to be time and money as well. They can't spend their whole day digging through all this stuff. So I don't have a question, as always, and I don't have a solution. I don't expect anyone to have a solution, but I'm just wondering, I mean, is this even a problem, you know? But it's striking when you really lay it out and see that it's like everyone's just kind of taking the word of the next person or the person before, right?
Yes. Yeah. It's like the game telephone, right? The message gets
Mm-hmm.
distorted or at least changed at each step. And so what I often do is I take a news article and then I try to trace it back to the source. And mostly that is very difficult because journalists have also gotten, I think, increasingly intransparent about where their material is coming from. And so you don't know if something is from a press release or not. Of course, if a quote is pulled from it, then you can trace it back. But so I try to do that, and then there's just so much interesting stuff that happens. And also it doesn't always go from extremely nuanced to completely unnuanced. There are sometimes nuances added halfway in the process, taken away again. And it's a really fun activity to do and always get good examples to use in classes. But then I teach about this to also students who don't necessarily have a background in science journalism or even in journalism. And they almost always are quite surprised by some of those changes of events that I show them. And then they ask me questions like, but is this even allowed? And who is checking this? And yeah, so it doesn't feel right when you look at the nitty gritty. But then again, no one else is really looking at science journalism that detailed. So it's really difficult to get into their minds and to see what sticks and what remains from all of the headlines that they've seen. Because also the problem is often in the headlines and the summary paragraphs.
That's actually another chain that maybe people don't understand, is that as a journalist, you don't write the headlines.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
We don't write the headlines. I don't know how many times I've had to explain that to some people, even sources that I've interviewed. And then they see the headline and they're like, I don't know if that's right, if we should say that. And I'm like, sorry, I don't do the headlines. And it's, so that's maybe, just another chain. But
yes. And many people only see a headline because they come across something in a feed and they might not have access because it's paywalled, or they might not be bothered to open it. So those headlines are at the same time very, crucial. So that's another sort of odd contradiction in this whole world.
Which again just kind of keeps bringing me back to that, like, if we think of journalism and how they cover true breaking news. There was a fire at this place. There's a flood here. It's good at that. But science doesn't really fit that well into this, right? Because even breaking science news, as we said at the beginning, can be old data that's being looked at in a different way or something. It's data, numbers that have been interpreted to mean something to the people in that field, which is then explained to someone else, the telephone game, right? So then it's like, I don't know. Then we're back at this, well, if not mass media, if not journalism in that sense, what do you do? And I think it just goes to the question of, well, not everyone's going to know about this because, and maybe not everyone needs to.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, because I started by saying that not all research should be communicated broadly or to mass audience, but I do think that there is an audience for all research or for everything, but it's just maybe not necessarily the general public within massive quotation marks.
Yeah.
You really have to think about this as a researcher, and it seems a really difficult exercise for many people to do because they're so into it, and that's understandable. I get the same thing now in my research as well, but I think it's really important for people to continue talking to just random people that have no clue about anything that you're doing, are not tied to academia or the scholarly world, and to talk to them about your research and to see what kind of questions that they ask. I think that is so valuable because it seems that doesn't happen enough, and that would be a really good way to sort of gauge for who your research would be interested in and in what way you might want to package it.
Hmm. And actually, I think that maybe those kind of interactions would be more meaningful to this if your goal is to reach this sort of naive audience that's not interested in science, which again is kind of weird to just say, and that it's like it's said all the time by researchers and press offices. It's like you would never do that if you're like, covering sports. You never be like, whoa, we got to get these people that hate basketball to read about basketball. It's like you never do that. But those moments, those interactions, I think would actually be the best way to do that. I've really been thinking a lot about science communication as almost stripping away the numbers and the data. And it's like, it's not about that. It's about the people that do it. Because and this is all kind of anecdotal. I see that for a lot of people that aren't already interested in science, aren't in that world, there's like there is a disconnect. There's a barrier. And in some cases, that's interest. I'm just not interested. I just don't really care. In many times, I see it as intimidation. I'm not going to understand this. Therefore, I'm just, it's nice that you do that, or that someone's doing that, and so they don't ask the questions. They don't. So I kind of feel like this idea of breaking down that barrier in terms of stigma, I guess, like if people understood what researchers are really, that they're just like everyone else, kind of like if you go to a science conference, the amount of alcohol and partying and stuff that goes on, like it's
surprisingly,
like, yeah, surprisingly, right? But then on the other hand, there's like maybe the science community doesn't want that image. Right. So there's kind of dueling motivations there. Right. It's like we have to keep this image of like, otherwise no one's going to trust us. They're not going to believe us. I don't know. Maybe they will trust you. Maybe they'll trust you more. I don't know. And maybe this is where science communication needs to think about less about the science and more about the scientists. I don't know.
Or more about the audience and the people, indeed. But there's so many things that I wanted to comment to.
You can interrupt me at any time. I'm very long-winded. I understand that.
That is okay. Just there were a lot of elements that you just mentioned. One thought that I had is that I think it's really important to also, if as a scientist who wants to communicate, is to be very transparent also towards yourself about your own objectives for wanting to do that. And indeed, there seems to still be this very strong idea that people should know about this, and we will tell that we should tell them about what the great things that we're doing. But that I don't think that's going to work really. And the sort of consensus now in science communication research is that doesn't work. It's this very linear model of people need to know about this and we'll tell them and then they'll know.
Yeah, the sort of knowledge deficit model.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so indeed, when maybe you have an article in the national newspaper that can be great, but the question still is, what is the effect? And indeed, maybe it is better to have a podcast that is listened to by a couple hundred people and they really respond to it, rather than one article that is then gone the next day or somewhere in the archives of the newspaper and no one remembers it, and who even has a subscription to newspapers these days. And, so we don't really know enough about the effect of different types of science communication in the audience. And again, it is always a bit difficult for me to talk about this because I'm also not too sure what the motive of science communication should be. I don't think it should be to convince anyone, even of the fact that science is great, because it also has its faults.
Yeah.
But that is
been used for some pretty nasty stuff.
Exactly. And all the things we just said and well, we haven't really touched upon problems with peer review, but there's also sort of issues within science, and for me it is also very difficult to sort of communicate enthusiastically, at least, about science, but also being transparent about the issues without making people completely want to abandon science. But I think it's fair that people distrust science. but they have to have good reasons for that. And I don't know if they always have really solid, well-researched reasons.
No, I think and maybe this is like just so we can keep it optimistic, although I don't know, maybe this is going to sound pessimistic. I think that unfortunately, the current state of a lot of, again, Western, but it feels like everywhere, is this, polarization, tribal politics and all that stuff. And science has been lumped into that, largely because of the pandemic and everything. But yeah, so now it's just kind of caught up in this thing. So it's like, I don't know that a lot of people that do, and I don't know, maybe this is really ignorant to say, and I try and catch myself when I fall into the trap of trying to say why people don't trust science and that they don't have a good reason. Like you just said, like we should be skeptical, but like be in the right way. And this is what we're talking about. You could be skeptical of all these events in the chain that we're talking about. We've identified some of these problems, but people that are just like, well, my team says this, so I don't vaccinate my kids, that feels like something that's happening. On the flip side, again, I could see, and I try to think about what are the motivations of those people? What is the fear that someone has exploited in them to convince them that vaccines are a bad idea? And this is, again, where I think that noble purpose of science communication, like people need to understand these things. There is certain topics that's true. And you said it too, like health, right? Like that's something that really affects all of us, especially public health, where your decisions can impact others, right? Behavior. But yeah, space, physics, maybe it's less, we don't have to get there. But yeah, I don't know. Again, I don't know. And I don't know that any of us have the answers. Like we sit around with the folks at BE SciComm and when we get together and stuff, and these are the things that we're talking about. So I guess it's kind of like science in that there's no endpoint, right? We shouldn't be searching for the endpoint. And maybe that's what science communication or this system of press release is. It's looking for a metric. We did it. We got X number of articles out there, so we achieved our goal.
Exactly. Yeah. And as you were saying that, I was also thinking that maybe the most successful, again, air quotations, communication or science communication is one-on-one conversation, or like very, very small scale, not that measurable in terms of output or how many people you reached. But for the people who are there at the moment, potentially very important and very crucial and very relevant. So I think maybe there should be a bit more of that. And I mean scientists reaching out to people that they really don't come across in their everyday life, if very diverse people. Because another interesting metric that someone recently pointed me towards is that apparently also in Belgium and maybe other European countries, even though that the trust is high, then if you ask whether they feel that science benefits them personally, people think that is largely a system that benefits people who are already well off. And so that is a very interesting way to also look at it, because it really points to indeed a big divide between different worlds. And I think it is really between researchers and that are still quite like upper class, if we want to use that
for
term.
Sure. Well, there's the ivory tower, right? It's the elites.
But it's not just in terms of a knowledge tower, but in terms of their position in society. And they do, I think, still struggle with reaching people who are far removed from that in many different regards. And one of the ways that I noticed that is that, for example, researchers and generally people always wanted to reach the quality newspapers, but in the end, those are read by a very small group of people. And so then those are the people who are already sort of on, who don't necessarily have to know, because they probably already do.
That's actually a really interesting point, how audiences see science working for them. And again, I think there's probably a number of different answers to that question, or or reasons why people would answer that question, it doesn't work for me. And they could still be, like you said, trust, or even be like, it's good that we do that, like that we go to the moon or whatever, or Mars, whatever. They're seeing this stuff and they're like, oh, that's cool that somebody's doing that. But so what? I still got to pay my bills. I still got to,
Exactly.
I definitely think that there is a disconnect there. And I mean, there is efforts, you see people trying to get, more kids involved, right? Like show them that they can become scientists, that sort of thing, that it's not out of their reach. I mean, we could probably debate whether it is for some people because there's a lot of barriers to becoming a scientist, the cost of education and all that stuff. But yeah, I think that this is a big thing, and we've kind of maybe danced around it a little bit, but focusing on the audience, right? I think a lot of science communication, again, doesn't really care about, not that they don't care. Let me rephrase that. Doesn't think a lot about the audience.
No, or maybe they think that they do, but they don't really visualize them in a very detailed way. I tend to agree with that. Depending on it's difficult.
You can't make a blanket statement,
but and also especially if you talk about the researchers who are doing the science communication, so not professionals who are working like yourself who are working in that field. I think they definitely aren't very aware of audiences, the potential audiences, and the best audience, or the people who actually are benefited from whatever it is that you're doing. I think there's definitely much work to be done there to bring those people together, but that requires so much time to find that niche. And as I said, sometimes it's not easily found, or they might not benefit directly from your research, but they might just find it interesting, and that can be enough. But that requires a lot of time, and I think that's a big problem.
Yeah, time and money, and that's what I think that was the thing that came out in one of the papers you sent me that you published. Like budgets is a big thing for newsrooms, and I just can't cover it all, and science is one of those things that falls away. I wonder, and we can start wrapping it up here because it's been an hour now, and we're not going to solve these problems tonight.
Unfortunately,
not. But I'm left thinking then, after this conversation, we have this system that has been built of, academic journals to press release to journals, to newspapers, and it's worked well. Maybe it's time to update that. And I think you mentioned in the introduction of some of your papers, not a lot of researchers look at that pipeline. So it's good that you are. And finding ways to either improve that pipeline, or maybe science communication is just always trying to grab onto the existing media machines or platforms or things when it should be thinking about building its own. And I don't know. I don't know if that's even possible. But it just feels like we're trying to fit into the journalism box because that's already there.
I guess it all starts with what do you really want to achieve, and then also that audience again. I think that's really important. Who do you want to reach, and why do you want to reach them? And that should always be the first questions. But I think indeed, as we started a conversation, the first question typically is, we should get this out there. How do you get this in a newspaper? So just changing that initial question maybe can be a start to a different way of looking at things.
Yeah. And I wonder, maybe there's a reluctance to do that because the idea of doing like more niche or more smaller scale communication efforts, like you said, it is a lot of time, but it's never been tried because the assumption is that the payoff is going to be small.
So I guess we should also do more research in terms of the effect of different types of interventions, I'll call them, different types of communication, because now it's easy to say, well, this was covered by this news outlet and they have so many readers or viewers or listeners. And so it can sound great, but again, you don't know what the actual effect on the audience has been, and it might be more beneficial or again, I struggle with using this word beneficial as if you're trying to convince people of something. But it might be more valuable to reach a smaller audience, but have them really engage with what you're telling them, and really enabling them to do something with what you're bringing to them. That is difficult to measure, but not impossible. And so maybe we should have more data on that so you could better convince people of the fact that sometimes it's worth doing more of a niche targeted communication.
I love, if we could summarize this conversation, because I don't know, it felt like it went a lot of different places for me, which I enjoyed. But I love the fact that we're questioning these things. I think that that's like a good first step. And it's something, again, that I do workshops with graduate students about storytelling. So who is your audience? Getting actual science communications professionals to really think about that. For the audience, understand this pipeline of how knowledge is created and then brought to you. Where are the different motivations that lie in that chain that could distort or change the message? Understand that it takes a lot of time to fact check, to do all these things and all that. So it's going to be difficult. And again, not to say don't trust everything that you see, but just understanding these things, I think, goes a long way to actually building the trust back. Is if you understand that and you can see it, then you can start to be like, okay, well, this I trust, this I don't, because of these reasons. So I think that's important. I don't know. Is there a takeaway message that you have?
Yeah, and what I wanted to add is that I think you should always hope for not a passive audience, but I feel that is often the perception, that the audience is rather a passive receiver, but more of an active audience. And so it is my hope that people who see things about science, even in mass media, and they're not necessarily interested, they still can see the relevance to their personal lives, but then also they can do something with that knowledge, and they can be critical about it, or they can respond to it, or they can change their behavior. But I hope that people think about the audiences as an active conversation partner, if you will, or not something that is just passively waiting for you to send out another press release. And
and then just take it on your word that it's all good and you should do this behavior, whatever, or think the way that I think about it, that kind of thing. All right, well, let's wrap it up for real. I won't start another tangent. I won't start another thread, although I want to. I just thank you for taking the time to do this. I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you did. I'm sure the audience will. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for tuning in. Let us know what you thought of this conversation. Did it inform you? Did it challenge an assumption you might have had about knowledge creation and how science gets reported, or how we should engage with science? Leave that in the comments when you also rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much, everyone. And tune in to social media at TwoBradForYou on Instagram. We do have an expansion to YouTube planned coming soon, maybe in May or June. So stay tuned for that. And as always, just take care. Have a good one. And we'll talk to you next time. Bye for now.